Let me read to you a passage from the 6th chapter of St. John's Gospel, verses 1 to 15. It's the Gospel for Friday of the second week of Easter. St. John writes, "Some time after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him, because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?' He asked this only to test him, because he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a little. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. 'Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?' Jesus said, 'Make the people sit down.' There was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, 'Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted.' So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, 'Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world.' Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to the mountain by himself." That's from John chapter 6, verses 1 to 15. Speaking of the heavenly bread. What do I mean? Well, there are many notable differences between the Gospel of St. John and the other 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke. John appears to assume in his readership a familiarity with one or other or all of the other Gospels. He uses the space of his own scroll to report fewer events, while giving at greater length and depth the words of Jesus and their doctrinal significance. For instance, Christ's claim to divinity is far more explicit in St. John. So too is his teaching on the Eucharist, even though he does not narrate the actual institution of it at the Last Supper. John seems to give us his favourite memories of the life and words of Jesus Christ, to which all of his life he found himself returning. Perhaps he wrote them down as he recollected and pondered them with the aid of the Holy Spirit, speaking of them to his many and various Christian audiences. Perhaps under the inspiration of the same divine Spirit, they became his written gospel, a document of a very different character from the synoptics. Mixed up with the profoundest of inspired insights were all kinds of historical details. Our Gospels seem today occurred, we read, on the far side of the Sea of Galilee. The Jewish feast of Passover was near. It was to Philip that he asked where bread was to be bought, and it was to test Philip that he said this. John remembers Philip's answer. Then John remembers that it was Andrew who reported that there was a boy present with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. All these details show the historical character of the event, and suppose that John has long been contemplating the scene and the words of Jesus. He has never forgotten them, and in this he has been assisted by the Holy Spirit, given to him on the evening of the day Jesus rose from the dead, as we read in John chapter 20, verse 22. Well, let us notice one detail in particular, which John takes care to mention. It is that the event now described occurred when the Passover feast of the Jews was near. This is the first thing he says after Jesus sits down on the mountain to survey the scene with the crowd before him. It is, we might say, the introduction to the event that follows, the hinted backdrop for an understanding of the event. As a matter of fact, the multiplication of the loaves is the only miracle, apart from the greatest of them, the resurrection, which is recorded in all four Gospels. But in the other Gospels, this miracle is not formally connected with the most significant of Christ's gifts to his church, the Holy Eucharist. For instance, we read in St. Luke that Christ took his disciples and went to the area of Bethsaida, in Luke chapter 9 verses 10 to 17. The crowds followed him, and he told his disciples to give them something to eat. They reply that all they have is five loaves and 2 fishes. We notice, incidentally, that there are not all the details here that John chooses to provide. As in John, there are about 5,000 men, and 12 baskets full of fragments are collected. Once the miracle is over, the scene moves on another location, where Christ is at prayer. He then asks who people say he is. There is nothing specific about a special meaning to be given to the miracle of the loaves and the fishes. The case is altogether different in John. The backdrop is the Paschal Feast. The Paschal Feast is mentioned 2 other times in John's Gospel: before the cleansing of the temple in Jerusalem by Jesus, chapter 2 verse 13, and again after the decision of the Sanhedrin to arrest and do away with Jesus in chapter 11 verse 55. Our scene today is clearly an introduction to Christ's doctrine on the Holy Eucharist, which is gradually expounded over the course of the entire chapter. Our scene today serves as an introduction, together with the miraculous event which immediately follows it, namely Christ's walking on the water to his disciples who are in difficulty. There, amid the great wind and standing in the midst of the sea, he declares, "It is I, do not be afraid." That "it is I" in Greek is ego eimi. It's reminiscent, by hindsight, of God's own holy name, given to Moses from the burning bush, "I am." Jesus is the divine source of the bread from heaven, given for the life of the world. Over the course of the same chapter, Christ will be extraordinarily explicit in his very public teaching on the true bread from heaven, which is his own flesh and blood. All must eat and drink of this if they are to have life everlasting. It is prefigured by the loaves and fishes. We see from John's account of this miracle that it was not worked simply as a sign of Christ's divine power. It was a sign of a very great miracle to come, with ramifications for every believer till the end of the world. It was a sign of the new Passover, and in particular of the Holy Eucharist. Jesus Christ is mankind's bread from heaven, but in a very concrete sense. The bread and wine used at the Paschal Feast became, by Christ's power and word, his own body and blood. It did not become this symbolically or figuratively, but really so. The whole person of Jesus Christ replaces the substance of the bread and wine, leaving the appearances alone untouched. As such, he is the life of the world. Let us recognize Jesus Christ, this heavenly bread, as our life then.